The views and opinions expressed in the following program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of KSMQ Public Service Media Incorporated or its assigns.
Welcome to this episode of Diversity Connections, Faith Edition. Thank you for joining us. We're discussing this topic, sacred space, from various faith perspectives. As we consider the topic of sacred space, I would like to suggest several questions for our conversants to respond to. How do you define space that is sacred as opposed to the ordinary, and what makes it sacred? We have two representatives here this evening, and I'd like to begin with Nakoma, our Native American representative. How do you define, in your tradition, Nakoma, how do you define sacred space? And tell us a little bit about what makes it sacred.
Well, in the first place, the overview of our traditional Native American people, those who try to maintain the good old ways. Obviously not the total culture like it used to be, but as much of preservation of the old good ways. To us, everything is sacred. All God's creations are sacred. First of all, beginning with what we call Father Sky and Mother Earth. The earth itself is, to us, a living being, is sacred and to be taken care of. Father Sky as well, respect for the galaxies, the stars, all of creation. Even outside the earth is a globe or a sphere that we consider an island in Father Sky. And all people share the same shoreline with Father Sky. So the earth is really special to us, and we want to take care of the earth. It is probably the prominent land base that is sacred to us. And beyond that, everything on Mother Earth is sacred. In our spirituality, we view the sky as our cathedral, Mother Earth our sacred ground, and our altar everywhere. Certainly we do have special locations, and every tribe would have their own special locations near their land base that is especially sacred to them. And I can get into it more specifically on some of those.
Okay, that would be good.
No?
Sure,
Okay.
sure.
Well, for instance, the Dakota people, especially the western Lakota in South Dakota, revere the Black Hills, and in particular Bear Butte, which is just east of Sturgis, where the big bike rally is every year. And right now there's a huge dispute over the sacredness of the territory surrounding Bear Butte, because especially during the rally there's a lot of ruckus goes on, a lot of noise, a lot of drinking, and we consider that sacrilegious to Bear Butte. So we're trying to keep the noise and the crowd and the saloons, I'd say about at least a 4-mile distance from Bear Butte, because people come from all over, not just the Lakota, but the Cheyenne and the Arapaho and people from all over the United States, learning about the sacredness of Bear Butte, which began probably millions of years ago as a volcano. It's a residue of a volcano. But we believe in our spiritual way that the Bear Butte, within Bear Butte is a giant bear. It actually is a bear called Bear Butte. But we go to Bear Butte to pray. We have offerings. If you go on Bear Butte, you'll see trees with little ribbon ties or tobacco pouches on it. It's also where our people go for what we call a vision quest. And This is all part of seeking purification and a balance in your life. There's a lot more to it than that, that's basically it. Sort of like our sweat, when we sweat in a sweat lodge. So Bear Butte is one of those special places. As I mentioned, the Black Hills, which in our language is Pahasapa, the Pahasapa, Sapa being black, Paha Hills. And just like in Spanish, our words are reversed. Instead of black hills, it hills black. So that's another special territory. In my life experience, I've spent a lot of time in the Black Hills, especially when I was younger. It's my old stomping grounds, and of course it's been abused. The Black Hills, just like any of our land, is not for sale in our old traditional way, and yet it's being taken over by commercialism, and we've been offered money by the government to buy the Black Hills from us, and we don't believe the Black Hills is for sale. If we accepted the money from the government, we would probably end up with a portion of the Black Hills. But that's not our way, and so we've refused the money.
You're getting into an area that I want to pursue a little bit later, but before we get into that, I would like to turn to Sister Marlys, and from the Christian tradition, and which is probably more familiar to most of our viewers. But tell us, from a Christian standpoint, what makes a place sacred? What makes anything sacred?
It's a very good question, because I don't think there's any answer. Only because I don't know there's any real consensus about what makes it sacred. No, there are some criteria that we use, in describing it. I would say probably the one thing that would be true is that I don't believe that any sacred space is static or unchanging, because it changes over time. It changes because of culture. It changes because of place. So there are a lot of variables when we talk about sacred space, even though in my own tradition, we do have spaces that we call sacred, like sanctuary.
Yes.
Sanctuary in my tradition certainly would be the place that we call sacred. And it is where we reserve the image or the presence of the sacred.
So that is actually set aside in a specific way, is that correct?
It is, yes. And when I say set aside, we treat it differently. We treat it with a different kind of respect, or with silence, or we have a way of genuflecting or bowing, or somehow remembering that this space that I'm in offers something different. And in some cases, people light candles to signify that. People bring flowers because they believe that there's a presence there. And you bring flowers when you come to someone's home or whatever. And it's a way of paying tribute. But and another place probably that we consider sacred is the altar of sacrifice, in which we bring to presence every day that we, in my case, have a mass or a liturgical celebration.
Right.
So that presence is what we are aware of, and that's what, in a sense, makes it different. So in a sense, it's a manifestation of our everyday world that it's somehow been blessed. Now, of course, since Vatican II, we have looked more broadly at what sacred space is. And we have other definitions that probably are more inclusive, or that bring us farther along into acknowledging what is sacred. Because like Lakota spoke about, we too believe that the earth is sacred, no matter where it is, and that Mother Earth is our mother, and we treat it with respect, with gentleness. We have, of course, this line that we use a lot: walk softly on the earth.
Yes.
And I think we, and particularly myself, who is a Franciscan, we believe that there are lots of ways in which we can walk gently on this earth. It might mean how we use water. It might mean how we get rid of our waste products. There are all sorts of ways in which we can be attentive to caring for Mother Earth.
Now, Nakoma just talked a little bit ago about buying and selling the land, about the way the land is used and taken ownership of, and from your standpoint, I suspect you would feel like it's being somewhat abused. And if both of you can respond to this, what does it mean to buy and sell the land then? If the land is sacred, what does it mean then to buy and sell the land?
Well, that topic is confusing, or was confusing in the early days of the government having treaties with us and so on, and the multitude of population coming in on top of us and forcing us out of there, and that happened to almost all the tribes, because we didn't see land as sellable. We were caretakers of the land. We weren't owners. We had no concept of owning the land, of owning the earth, or any part of it.
What did it mean then to occupy a space, whether it be a territory for a tribe or a village? What did it mean to you then to occupy that space?
Well, every tribe had to have a territory in which to hunt and fish and trap and build their villages and so on, especially along the waterways. And so we respected those territories. So in a sense, we had an idea of territory for each tribe.
Right.
But there was a lot of overlap.
Sure.
For instance, Kentucky, very few tribes set up villages in Kentucky. It was more or less a no man's land hunting territory for any tribe. There's Pipestone, Minnesota, where we get the special red stone for our sacred pipes that we use during prayer. That was also a no man's land. Nobody owned it. Nobody thought they were any better than anybody else when we were there. So you could have bitter enemies coming to Pipestone at the same time, and there was no fight, no nothing, because this was sacred ground, and you just didn't, you put your arguments aside and respected the area. So that's an example.
So in a sense, sacred ground can help to break down barriers that tend to separate people, tribes, families, and so on.
Yeah, it can, and these would be throughout the continent, for different areas. Like in Wyoming, there's the famous medicine wheel up in the mountains there, way up, very impressive. It's probably about as big as this whole room here in a circle, made out of stones. And there are such medicine wheels all over North America. That's just the most famous one. And people can visit it. Now they have a kind of a fence around it to keep people from disturbing it. But the medicine wheel is very symbolic and sacred to us of the entire universe, and the different sacred directions and all the creatures, all the different energies that are part of it. It's also seen as kind of a celestial observatory to see the rise of the sun in the morning and so on points of the medicine wheel. I do a lot of lecturing just on the medicine wheel. There's a lot to it. But this is a location where many peoples will come to it and respect it, our native peoples. Of course, tourism comes too, but it would be, and who knows when it was made. Could have been 600-700 years ago, could have been 5,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago. We don't know how old it is. But that's just another example, like Pipestone, where our people could come in peace and pray and pay tribute to the earth, to the Father Sky, and to all of nature.
I'm wondering, Marlys, do you have anything to?
Well, my response to that would be very similar, and that is, I think when we talk about sacred space, I think one of the reasons that it's considered holy ground or sacred is that it is to be used by the community. For example, last week or whenever they had the fire in St. Charles, the church became the gathering place for people who had no place to go. The sanctuary was sacred. It was a place for people to be safe. Or I'm thinking also of the immigration raids that have happened in recent years, particularly the one down in Postville, Iowa, in which that space was held sacred by whatever kind of person arrived at the door who needed assistance. And in the same way, I would say that is why it's sacred. It's because it's for the use of the community, for the care of humanity in that setting. And it provides a place for people to see their relationship with each other on an even keel with everyone.
Right. So some churches have become sanctuaries to refugees.
Correct, yes.
To those who are being oppressed one way or another, a safe place to come to.
Right.
So if I hear you correctly, what you're saying is that human needs, human values take precedence over anything else in terms of the use of that space.
Yes, yes, definitely.
Okay. So what are we saying then about what really makes these places sacred? I mean, you talked about, Nakoma, about use or about special significance that's attached to place, and I think you also, Marlys. And who determines the unique sacredness of any of these places? Is it community tradition? Is it individuals? Is it leaders? Who makes that determination?
Well, in our case, who knows when it started, because we've been around for many, many thousands of years. And these sites have been around even longer than that.
Right.
And so when a tribe, and there was a lot of migration of tribes. Very few tribes are in the same location where they started out hundreds or even thousands of years ago. Migrations were very common. And so each tribe really has these special sacred places. As to who determines it, like I said, it's just so old. Who knows who selected which site for the sacredness? And I would like to mention, I think Sister Marlys mentioned it earlier about the burial grounds. I can, throughout the southeast United States and up the Mississippi, right up to Cahokia Mounds in Illinois, and right up to the effigy mounds in just over into Iowa, along the Mississippi, and many other sites. There's burial mounds, ancient burial mounds up and down the Mississippi on this side in Minnesota that are hidden. But these are our ancestors. Chief Blackhawk of the Sac and Fox, his people migrated into what is now known as Rock Island and Moline, the Quad Cities along the Mississippi, where the Rock River flows into the Mississippi. And up on a hilltop is where they buried their people. And when Blackhawk was his people were forced to move from that area, this was really something because they're leaving their ancestors. They're abandoning them. And and people that were forcing that on us didn't understand or appreciate or respect that whatsoever. And this happened to all the tribes. Almost all the tribes had what we call a trail of tears. And forced out of our homeland. And it wasn't just moving from one area to another, it was leaving our ancestors. And this was very, very troubling to our people. Cahokia Mounds, these go back about 1,000 years. And with the big one called Monk's Mound, this is all very sacred ground. My wife and I always go to a powwow that's held there in September every year. at Cahokia Mounds, and they have a wood henge, kind of like Stonehenge in England. There's a wood henge where the people would, respecting the sun and the star movements and so on, kind of an observatory, just like the medicine wheel in Wyoming, but also used for sacred ceremonies.
Now, Nakoma, you mentioned several places that you have been to and that have special significance to you. You have experienced their sacredness in unique ways. Are you able then to go to other areas, and the same thing would be true for you, Marlys, to other areas that have been identified by others as being sacred and experience the sacredness of that particular place? Maybe you're from the Midwest, maybe from the Northwest or from the Southeast, someplace that's quite different, and yet you would find sacredness there also that you could experience personally.
Well, like the Taos in New Mexico, Blue Lake is very sacred to them.
Yes.
If I was to go there, I would be very respectful as any traditional native from whatever tribe would be. I would probably even offer a pinch of tobacco in the area, which is a very common among the tribes to pay respect.
Right.
And we often do this on graves or wherever we're at. You would offer tobacco. So yes, we would be respectful as long as we knew that Blue Lake was sacred to the Taos.
Exactly.
If a Native American came there and didn't know that, obviously he's got some learning to do before he comes to the area. So yeah, I've lived and worked in South America a lot. I lived with a Amazon tribe for 2 years. I've been to Machu Picchu in Peru a couple of times, climbed all over the place. Most tourists they come there and they love the place.
Yeah.
But they don't understand the significance of it, the sacredness of it.
Take pictures and leave.
And you know, it's a lot of history there, and you have to be respectful of everything and leave things as they are. Don't tamper with it, and just enjoy the view and learn as much as you can about it.
Marlys, what about you have a lot of sacred places, don't you, that you can identify?
Yes, but I'm just thinking about travels around the world and how in each of these places it ends up being something different. For example, last year I was in Israel, and sort of connecting with your last question about ownership, what I didn't know about Israel is that all the land is owned by the government, which I think is kind of interesting. And this is this Israel, Jordan, Palestine, Jerusalem area, that this in fact is, you know, where my belief system begins with Jesus, and the fact that no one owns that land, but yet in that territory there is a sacredness. For example, the Holy Sepulchre, and there is the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem has it's a traditional holy site for the Christians.
Right.
It also has other traditions that share the same building as they do. So in a sense, they all have a piece of it and all believe that it's sacred in some way. Now, within a short distance, the Muslims, of course, have the Dome of the Rock that they hold sacred, and we would respect that. Being Christian, respect that that's what Muslims would hold sacred. And I think the Jewish tradition at the same time, believe the Temple of the Mount is very important there. So just in that little neighborhood by itself, there's a lot of understanding of what is sacred and how you respect it and what you do for it. And I was also thinking about my experience in Cambodia. I went to the killing fields. And in the killing fields, they do have, a huge mound, where bodies are still buried, although they have exhumed some of them. And they have created the map of Cambodia out of the bones of the people who were buried there. And as I was touring it, I just had this incredible sense of pain within me. And even now, I just sort of feel goosebumps coming on my skin, thinking about it. The interesting thing that happened to me there is that while I was there, I tried to take a picture of it, but my camera wouldn't work. Taking a picture of this map with all these bones on it, but then 5 minutes later I was in some other location and my camera worked. And I thought to myself, oh, this really is a little jolt, to my own understanding of what is sacred. And in a sense, this is a sacred space, and I ought not to, take home and show everybody this photograph of it, like a tourist.
Yeah.
So it was a revelation to me on sort of what happened to me in that process.
What an interesting reminder that would be to you.
It is.
To respect the sacredness the unique sacredness of each place that we've talked about and identified.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And realize what makes them sacred.
Right.
But underneath it all, certainly for the Native American tradition and for the Christian tradition, the fact that it is all the work of the hand of the Creator to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
that is what makes it, that's the foundation of sacredness to us.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That's what we need to think about when we think about sacred space.
I think about Dachau too, and that space,
Yeah.
and how that is sacred.
Thank you for tuning in. To get more information, log on ksmq.org and click on Diversity Connections. While you are there, you can see highlights from your favorite episodes, read the blogs, and submit your own experiences and ideas. Thanks for watching. Join us next time as we discuss diversity in our communities, where we all can make a difference.